Hello and welcome to David's Politics Show. The nature of undersea warfare is changing, and the silent service has to evolve to meet today's, and above all, tomorrow's challenges. But just what should that adaptation look like? How is the role played by the submarine changing in an increasingly contested undersea environment? And how should the US Navy in particular think about choosing platforms and a force structure that will meet the non-trivial challenges posed by the Chinese Navy's increasingly sophisticated and increasingly numerous submarine force? With me to discuss all this is Bryan Clark, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology at Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. A former submariner himself, he is an expert in naval operations, electronic warfare, and autonomous systems, and has led studies for the DoD Office of Net Assessment, as well as DARPA on new technologies and the future of warfare. Bryan, it's great to have you on the podcast for the first time. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here. I appreciate it.
So I'd like to start by kind of setting the stage for our listeners, because the conversation obviously can easily get quite technical. So just to kind of frame our discussion, as I mentioned in the intro, for the longest time, the silent service, as the submarine force has traditionally been called, was basically all about being quiet, right? The quieter you were, the better. And U.S. submarines, for a good chunk of the Cold War, had a definite advantage in that. And submarines were also out there very often on their own, kind of doing their thing. But there have been some technological developments over the last couple of decades, really since the end of the Cold War, that mean that, again, things are changing, and it might not be enough anymore to be as quiet as possible. So could you give our listeners kind of a sense of why that is, kind of what has been the trajectory since the end of the Cold War? And what are some of the changes, the technological developments, et cetera, that mean that we might have to start thinking again about what a submarine does under the water?
Yeah, David. So the big changes have to do with how opponents of the U.S. And the Western powers, if you will, are adapting to the superiority of U.S. and to some degree NATO submarines. So you look at China or Russia, for example, and both have understood that U.S. submarines are a major threat to them. You know, it's probably one of the most significant advantages that the U.S. military has over both of those countries. And that derives mostly, as you said, from the fact that the U.S. submarine force is still the most capable, has the quietest submarines, and in a lot of ways the most sophisticated submarines. And it really creates this very asymmetric advantage for the United States when it can operate to some degree unimpeded off an enemy's coast and threaten to attack it without much notice, cut off its access to the sea by attacking shipping, and then gather intelligence in peacetime or even in conflict. So this creates a lot of neuralgia and anxious considerations on the part of foreign militaries. So they've invested in trying to undermine that advantage, and they've taken sort of an interesting approach by embracing new technologies. So, for example, both countries have invested heavily in undersea infrastructure that would be able to do surveillance underwater. So sonar systems, both active and passive. So active that send out sound energy and attempt to get reflections off of submarines, and then also passive systems that attempt to listen for the noise that a submarine might generate. The U.S. developed these systems during the Cold War, the SOSUS arrays that people talk about, that helped kind of monitor the both U.S. coasts as well as those around our allies during the Cold War to look for Soviet submarines back in those days.
Right.
The newer versions of these can take advantage of digital technology, AI-enabled processing, and also exploit the fact that both China and Russia are likely to be the home teams, if you will, in any confrontation with the United States. So they're both going to probably be in conflicts like you see with Russia and Ukraine that are in their backyard.
Mm-hmm.
So U.S. submarines are going to have to travel there to be able to, enforce U.S. deterrence, and then eventually, maybe get into a conflict with those countries. So they can install these undersea sensing arrays around their coasts, and wait for U.S. Submarines to attempt to gain entry. Now the U.S. submarines are still the quietest and still can largely evade these detection systems today. But the challenge will be is if you get into a conflict and submarines have to launch missiles or launch torpedoes or launch unmanned undersea vehicles to attempt to threaten an adversary or hold it at risk or contain its shipping,
Hmm.
then the submarine becomes detectable because it's making noise when it does all of these activities, and then can quickly be beset upon by an opponent's anti-submarine warfare forces. So airplanes, ships, dropping depth charges, dropping torpedoes, and that's going to drive the submarine out because the submarine just doesn't have a way to necessarily defend itself against those threats. So a submarine is
Right.
likely to evade when it's faced with these kinds of challenges rather than trying to stand and fight, like a surface ship might use its missile defenses to stand and fight, or a fighter aircraft could evade and attack and continue fighting. A submarine is slow and doesn't have a lot of self-defense. So generally, once you're detected, you have to think about an exit strategy
Hmm.
and make your way out of there. So that's the big challenge right now is the realization on the part of these countries that they have this disadvantage, but they also realize that they can exploit the fact that they're the home team to be able to build out the undersea infrastructure that would enable them to threaten U.S. submarines if they did try to execute operations in these countries near abroad.
Right. Yeah. Fantastic. That's I think a great way to frame the rest of the discussion. And I want to come back. I want to come back later to this point you made. This very interesting point about the fact that to kind of in a sense marginalize the submarine, as powerful as it may be as a platform, to marginalize it. In fact, all you need to do is to make it run away, right? And there's something
Right,
I've heard you say about the example of the Second World War, which I want to come back to later.
right.
But you've put out some really interesting ideas about how to kind of regain the upper hand in undersea warfare, or at least pose challenges for the adversary. And some of those ideas are, first of all, this notion of kind of going against the grain of trying to be as quiet as possible and actually insonifying the water, right? Actually making the water
Right,
noisier to confuse the
right.
environment. And another one that I'd like you to kind of tell our listeners about is this idea that it can't just be about evasion anymore. It also has to be about actively trying to go out, go for the other guy's defense, right? Taking out
Right.
their SOSUS arrays, or somehow trying to suppress their sensors. So could you kind of expand on that and tell our listeners kind of how you think about how these different ways are going to have to come into play?
Yeah, so David, I think we can draw an analog back to the late World War II, early Cold War period when air defenses, first became more capable. So during the Second World War, we had obviously multiple generations of fighter aircraft, culminating in jet aircraft at the end of the war. And air defenses really consisted mostly of flak guns that you see in the movies. It's a relatively low altitude air defense artillery.
Hmm.
And as airplanes became more capable, they could fly above that air defense artillery. And so an opponent that was trying to defend his airspace would have to use fighter aircraft to do it. So it's a very cumbersome and time consuming effort, right? Because you're trying to use your own aircraft to defend against the other guy's aircraft. And so you saw in the early Cold War, though, the advent of missile based air defenses. So guided surface to air missiles like the SA 2 and the obviously following generations all the way up till today made it so that an adversary could much more sustainably defend their airspace from airplanes at a very high altitude. So airplanes couldn't just avoid the air defenses by going higher. They had to actually come up with ways to degrade, evade, defeat air defenses.
Hmm.
And so that led to, in a lot of ways, the introduction of electronic warfare. So electronic warfare became in World War II kind of a key capability that the Allies used to defeat German, air defenses. Germans used it against Allied bombing campaigns, and then going into the Cold War, it was used to really refine this ability to suppress and then eventually destroy an enemy air defense system. So looking at the undersea case, we're seeing a lot of the same trends play out where adversaries are putting in relatively fixed defenses. So they're putting in these sensor arrays that are designed to act as the observation posts or targeting systems for then missile-based or even airplane-based torpedoes and bombs that would be dropped on the submarine. So in a lot of ways, it has a relationship to how we treat how air defense has evolved. And so a lot of the same techniques might be needed. So,
Hmm.
like airplanes use jammers and electronic decoys to confuse, distract, overwhelm enemy air defense sensors. You might use the same kinds of techniques underwater. So use acoustic decoys to attract the attention of undersea defenses away from the submarine. Use acoustic jammers to overwhelm the sensor array so it can't target where the submarine might be. It can't see it, just like a
Hmm.
jammer would with an air defense system trying to find an aircraft. And then just like we do against air defenses, where eventually you want to go destroy the air defense system to get it out of the way, you might have to go and destroy some of these undersea defenses to eliminate them as a potential threat. Um, and so those same techniques could be ported over from the the aviation world, and some of the same lessons might be applied as well. Some of the lessons from the aviation world were to try to make your efforts at suppressing enemy air defenses as low cost and low overhead as possible,
Hmm.
because the early examples of that involved a lot of aircraft that were devoted simply to jamming, decoy, attacking enemy air defenses, and it made it so that like during the Vietnam War, half of the strike packages that went against North Vietnam were were aircraft designed to suppress enemy air defenses, as opposed to actually bomb carrying strike aircraft. And so to keep from that overhead consuming your entire force,
Yeah.
you need to think about, how do I do this suppression and attack on undersea defenses using the unmanned systems? So I'm not devoting submarines to this mission. I can instead do this with unmanned systems that can free up the submarine to be able to execute its mission with
Hmm.
less chance of being engaged by the enemy's undersea defenses.
Yeah, it's really interesting how there are these parallels between the different domains, right? Between undersea warfare and what is happening on land and in the air. And also there is these really interesting historical parallels, right? As I mentioned, one of the kind of points you've been making is that there is a tendency to kind of think, well, if our submarines are still a generation ahead of especially Chinese and Russian submarines, although that may be slightly less true in cases of Russian submarines. But in any case, if our submarines are kind of just simply better, then we can basically sit pretty. But in fact, if you look at the interesting example of what happened in the Second World War, the lesson there is actually that no matter how good your submarines may be, the defender, as it were, all they have to do is kind of push your submarines away constantly, right? Make them constantly
Right.
run away. It doesn't necessarily They don't necessarily have to actually kill your submarine, and something like that could play out, in and around Taiwan too, right? So tell us how you've been thinking about that parallel, and what are the conclusions you draw from that?
Yeah, so we found in a lot of our research that we've done for DARPA and for other government agencies and published over the years, is that a lot of times the victor in a particular battle or campaign ends up not winning because they were able to destroy all the enemy or destroy even a substantial portion of the enemy. It was mainly because they were able to convince the enemy that it could not achieve its objectives on its own terms, right? So eventually the
Hmm.
adversary decides, we're not going to get to where we want to be, within an acceptable timeline, with acceptable losses, and so we're going to, take a different path, or we're going to, look for an off ramp. That was true in a lot of cases, even during the Second World War, Battle of the Atlantic. So during the Battle of the Atlantic, the German submarine fleet, had many losses, as we've seen from the movies and reading from books. But of the 400 plus submarines that the Germans built during the war, by the end of the war, they still had a couple hundred left. So there was
Hmm.
still plenty of submarines to go execute the campaign. And if you look at the Battle of the Atlantic over the 5 years or so that it was waged, um, it certainly losses essentially toward the end of the war mounted. But even at the end of the war, there were more submarines at sea in the Atlantic than at the beginning of the war. But they just weren't imposing any losses on
Hmm.
the Allied shipping. And then about right, and that turned, about 1943 when the Allies started to mount a more aggressive ASW campaign with, escort ships that could go all the way, and escort aircraft that could cover the gap between, the Atlantic coast and Europe.
Hmm.
And then also, we're able to bring some aircraft carriers to bear to have aircraft launch off aircraft carriers and do anti-submarine warfare. So even though the Germans weren't suffering massive losses of submarines and still had plenty of submarines by the end of the war to have prosecuted an anti-shipping campaign, they were just not being very effective because the Allied ASW effort was basically pushing the submarines away and preventing them from getting into an advantageous position.
Hmm.
So the submarines were marginalized. That investment was largely lost, to the Germans as a tool, of warfighting. So in the Taiwan case, you could see, the relatively small number of U.S. submarines that would be, able to be brought to bear in a Taiwan scenario. So, whatever, a dozen or less submarines. It wouldn't take much to start taking them out of the fight if you detected them as they were doing their initial missile launches, their initial torpedo attacks,
Hmm.
and you just started dropping munitions on them and forcing them to evade. They wouldn't be able to continue doing the work that they were charged with doing,
Right.
and they may attempt to come back, but they would largely be lost from the fight. And I
Hmm.
think U.S. plans. If you look at how U.S. defense leaders talk about the submarine force, U.S. plans in a lot of ways hinge on submarines being effective in the early days of any sort of conflict over Taiwan. So it
Right.
creates this vulnerability that the U.S. needs to address, by making submarines more survivable in these environments, and submarine crews more confident in their ability to kind of stand and fight, even when it looks like they're going to be potentially under attack.
Yeah. No, that's so interesting, and it's such a, I think, useful and sobering kind of reality check, right, on the otherwise perhaps slightly overconfident sense of security in the fact that we have better submarines and whatnot.
Right.
Um, but this brings me nicely to this question of force structure, and kind of how all these developments are going to affect the role of the submarine. So I'd like to ask you, how you think about, especially if we look at again at what's happening on the land domain, right? There too, we're starting to see, if in Ukraine, for example, we're starting to see, really the kind of the fruition of this kind of trend that's been going on for a while of cheaper unmanned vehicles of one sort or another, whether they're drones or whatever, however one wants to call them, which can, through sheer numbers, ultimately overwhelm, really exquisite platforms like, an Abrams tank or whatever, or a Challenge tank or whatever the case may be. So, how do you think about, what is the right balance to strike between having, really incredibly expensive but also very sophisticated platforms, like a submarine, versus the need to have just a ton of way cheaper and way more attritable platforms, possibly unmanned platforms, doing other things. What's kind of the how should we think about the how to kind of strike the balance there?
Yeah, David, that's a good question. And so, what we see in Ukraine is that these systems have been very effective, and can take out even much more sophisticated, opposing systems. The difference, though, is that they kind of those small, cheap, numerous systems also tend to be relatively slow in the grand scheme of things, and relatively short range, and
Hmm.
they won't necessarily be able to go fast or long distance or even both. So let's say you look at Ukraine and the Shahed 136, which has been the kind of the mainstay for a while of Russian drone attacks from long range.
Hmm.
It can go 1,000 kilometers. So it can go from Russia all the way to Kiev without too much difficulty. The fact that though is it's slow, so there's lots of opportunities potentially to shoot it down along the way, and against a more capable adversary, those Shaheds probably wouldn't make it, right? Just because they'd be
Hmm.
too easy to shoot down during their 500 kilometer, 1,000 kilometer journey. And so that's the downside of the smaller, cheap many systems is they work great in a constrained or confined geographic environment where you can either go very fast for a short distance, and they work sometimes in a situation where you can combine them with more capable systems like the Russians have done, and use them to sort of overwhelm the enemy's defenses before the bigger, higher end systems come in and finish the job. So those are the two models that we've seen in Ukraine that you could see applied, in Taiwan context, right? So if Taiwan fielded a lot of the kinds of capabilities that you see in Ukraine, for essentially pushing back on an invader, they can be pretty effective at slowing down and disrupting a Chinese invasion. but those systems are not going to sink necessarily. A lot of large amphibious ships or container ships or transport ships or even destroyers and cruisers that might be with them, but they certainly could disrupt them. They can certainly damage them. They can certainly slow down and disrupt the timing of the orchestration of the operation.
Hmm.
But you need to sort of combine those with higher end weapons that would be able to take out these platforms entirely, or at least remove them from the fight semi-permanently. The reason being, like in an invasion scenario, so China is going to send over multiple waves of ships with troops to come ashore, and if your unmanned systems just slow that down and degrade some of them, they can still return, get repaired, or even just go pick up the next wave of troops and bring them into Taiwan. So they won't necessarily be able to finish the job on their own. You need to combine them with torpedoes, anti-ship missiles, that could render a mission kill or a complete kill on these ships. So that's where submarines, and aircraft and surface combatants, come into play, because they can employ those more effective weapons. But you really need to use them in combination, right? Because those
Hmm.
more effective weapons, they might not make it to the target because defenses can shoot them down. They need the targets to shoot at, so they need the targets to be kind of in a box where you can engage them.
Right.
And that's where your smaller systems can be really effective, is in causing the invasion to slow down, disrupting its timing, creating essentially a kill zone, where you can then employ your longer range missiles to go and torpedoes, to go finish them off. And I think that model is what you're going to see, replicated in both wargaming and conflicts going forward, where people are going to look at these smaller systems as being a complement to the larger, more capable systems,
Hmm.
because they give you that ability to undermine and degrade the opponent's defenses before you come in with the more expensive weapons that you don't have very many of.
Right, right. So, and how do you see the role of the attack submarine changing in that kind of environment? Will it be more of a kind of a command and control type platform, which sort of maybe lurks a little bit farther away at a safer distance and kind of tries to control the threat environment? Or is it still going to have ultimately a kind of um, old school kind of attack role of going in there and sinking ships,
Right.
doing cruise missiles, etc.?
Yeah. So what's we've done a bunch of wargaming on this recently, and we'll do some more going forward. But one of the big takeaways was that modern larger transport ships and amphibious ships and even some surface combatants either are so large that even capable cruise missiles will have difficulty sinking them because they're just so large that you could put out the fires and keep going.
Hmm.
Um, and of course, surface combatants have air defenses, so you have to shoot a lot of missiles at them to eventually break through. Um, and submarine torpedoes, though, don't have there's not very effective a defenses to submarine torpedoes yet. And so the idea would be, the torpedo is actually turning out to be the most lethal weapon in the arsenal of those countries that have good submarines. And you may find that we end up reverting kind of that old school model where the submarine's most effective employment is doing torpedo engagements against the highest value targets, and
Right.
that we need to use the unmanned systems to be able to allow the submarines to get in close enough to to do those engagements. Meanwhile, you're going to use a combination, like I said, of smaller unmanned systems to disrupt the invasion and slow it down, and then use your longer range fires to take out those ships. So you could see submarines sort of having to shift back to that kind of original role, just because torpedoes are still something that's very difficult to defend against.
Hmm.
And even one or two torpedoes will sink a large ship, whereas one or two cruise missiles may not even cause sufficient damage to cause it to go home.
Right, right. Yeah. There's nothing like a torpedo to break a ship in half, right?
Right,
At the end of
right.
the day. Yeah. Great. We're coming towards the end, Brian. I want to turn now more to kind of talk a little bit more specifically about the Taiwan scenario, or the Taiwan situation, let's say. Um, could you give our listeners a sense of what you think is the Chinese kind of perspective on this? What do they think they will do with their submarines? Are they, planning on actually kind of getting out there and trying to prevent, for example, U.S. Aircraft carrier task force from even getting close to Taiwan, or is it more of a kind of bastion strategy, just sitting there trying to make everything as difficult as possible for U.S. submarines and ships in the area? And if you could tell us also what you think about, I mean, this I don't want to ask you to kind of reveal anything delicate, but what does it mean? Because I'm just curious about this. What does it mean when people say, U.S. subs are still a generation ahead?
Right. Yeah. So one thing that we've seen, kind of shift, or I think is going to continue shifting, is, as I said, submarines, for a while post Cold War, they took on a lot of new roles, right? So they were doing, cruise missile launches. They were doing, insertion of special operations forces. They were doing missile, or rather, um, uh, so they're doing missile attacks, soft
Hmm.
insertion, intelligence gathering.
Right.
The And what we're seeing now is we start thinking about, well, what is it really going to look like when submarines are employed in a conflict? And they're going to revert to this more traditional role of being torpedo attack platforms. Um, and then you look at the Chinese Navy, and the Chinese Navy really never transitioned away from that. So the Chinese Navy's submarine force has been mostly focused on using torpedoes and to some degree using anti-ship missiles to attack surface shipping. And that was a mission that the U.S. Navy had sort of moved away from in the post-Cold War environment, because we kind of felt like there was other things that the submarines were better suited to do. And now
Hmm.
you're seeing the U.S. kind of come back to that model where the Chinese really never left it. So China's submarines are likely to be used to do, like you said, uh, submarine torpedo attacks on U.S. Surface fleets, and maybe anti-ship cruise missile attacks on those same surface ships. But I think what we're seeing with the Chinese Navy as well is this recognition that anti-ship cruise missiles you can get shot down, and unless you launch a lot of them, you're not necessarily going to guarantee a hit against a modern surface combatant.
Hmm.
Like we've seen, off Yemen, where you've had the Houthis launch multiple cruise missiles against U.S. ships, and they all get shot down.
Right.
A submarine doesn't carry enough weapons to be able to launch large salvos of cruise missiles out of surface ships. So you may find that they revert back to torpedo attacks, and that ends up being the most effective way that they have to try to push back U.S. naval forces. So that's what the expectation is that they'll use their Yuan air-independent propulsion submarines to conduct torpedo attacks, or threaten torpedo attacks at least, against U.S. surface fleets that are operating in like the Philippine Sea, or out towards Guam or beyond.
Hmm. Okay, very very interesting. And do you see them threatening, for example, undersea cables in the early stages of a conflict?
Yeah, so the Chinese, there's been accusations against China of damaging undersea cables. Most recently, a civilian merchant ship in the Baltic Sea the Chinese flagged
Hmm.
damaged some undersea cables between Finland, or I'm sorry, Estonia and Finland. And the expectation was, well, maybe that was on purpose. So I do think you'll see examples of China using that kind of very primitive approach to attack undersea cables. So probably surface ships dragging anchors, um, you know, divers in some cases, but probably not submarines. They don't have the submarine capabilities to do undersea cable manipulation or damage.
Hmm.
Russia, in contrast, though, has a very robust force designed around the idea of undersea seabed reconnaissance and seabed operations. So I could see
Right.
Russia definitely doing something much more sophisticated, but China is likely to probably do some damage to undersea cables, and then most of the time use their submarine force to try to push out to threaten U.S. naval forces and make them operate at longer distances from China. And
Hmm.
then going back to your previous question about the generations of submarines, normally it's a vague definition, but in general it means how acoustically quiet is the submarine, how
Hmm.
good are its sensors at being able to detect the enemy. So acoustic superiority is a combination of you being quiet and you being able to detect the other guy before he detects you.
Right.
And that's generally what it comes down to. So when people say U.S. submarines are a generation ahead, it means they're still a decade plus ahead in terms of how effectively they can detect the enemy before they themselves get detected.
Hmm. Right. Okay, fantastic. That was really, really interesting. Our time is up, so I want to just end by encouraging the listeners to find more of your work on the Hudson Institute website at hudson.org. There's also the YouTube channel, and there's some really interesting conferences and discussions there. And you're also on Twitter /X/ whatever it's called these days. Your the handle is @ClarkDefense. So this has been a really fun chat, Bryan. So thanks so much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure, David. Thanks for having me on.